The corporate gala was in full swing when CFO Daniel Hayes spotted the janitor near the buffet table, and with a cruel smirk, he issued a challenge that would change everything. "Sing just one song," he dared, "and I'll quit my job right here, right now." The room fell silent as James accepted, his hands trembling as he approached the microphone. Nobody expected what happened next. The moment his voice filled that grand ballroom, grown executives began wiping their eyes, and the CFO's arrogant smile vanished completely. What nobody knew was that this wasn't just any song. It was written for someone James had lost, and his secret past was about to shake the entire company to its core. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. James Robertson stood in the corner of the Grandview Hotel's Crystal Ballroom, his janitor's uniform a stark contrast to the designer suits and evening gowns swirling around him. The annual corporate gala for Meridian Industries was the kind of event he usually cleaned up after, not during. But tonight, there had been a last-minute spill in the main hallway, and his supervisor had sent him in to handle it. At 42 years old, James had learned to make himself invisible in spaces like this, spaces where people with money and power gathered to celebrate themselves, while people like him scrubbed their floors and emptied their trash cans. The ballroom sparkled with enough wealth to make his head spin, chandeliers dripping with crystals that probably cost more than his annual salary, tables draped in silk cloths the color of champagne, and centerpieces bursting with exotic flowers he couldn't even name. The company had spared no expense for this celebration of their record-breaking fiscal year, and why wouldn't they? When the executives in this room had just awarded themselves bonuses that could buy houses, while workers like James got a $50 gift card to a chain restaurant and a half-hearted thank you email. James pushed his cleaning cart along the perimeter of the room, trying to stay out of sight while keeping an eye out for any messes that needed immediate attention. The DJ was set up on a small stage at the far end of the ballroom, currently playing smooth jazz that provided a backdrop for the mingling crowd. James recognized most of the faces from his 3 years working the night shift at Meridian's headquarters, though none of them had ever really looked at him, not properly anyway. To them, he was just part of the scenery, as forgettable as the potted plants scattered throughout the venue. His daughter Sophie was at home with Mrs. Chen from next door, probably already asleep even though it was only 8:30 on a Saturday night. At 7 years old, Sophie was used to her father working odd hours, used to him missing school events and bedtime stories because someone had to pay the bills. Someone had to keep the lights on in their small 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city. James worked the night shift as a janitor because it paid slightly more than the day shift, and every extra dollar mattered when you were raising a child alone. The memory of his wife Elena still hit him in unexpected moments. 3 years gone, and sometimes it felt like yesterday. Sometimes it felt like a lifetime ago. She had been the dreamer in their relationship, the one who believed his music could take them somewhere, while James had been content playing small venues and open mic nights, never really pushing for more. After she died, he'd packed away his guitar, unable to bear the weight of melodies that reminded him of everything he'd lost. The music had been theirs, something they'd shared, and without her, the songs felt hollow. Daniel Hayes, the chief financial officer of Meridian Industries, stood near the bar with a cluster of other executives, his booming laugh cutting through the gentle jazz music like a knife. At 55, Hayes had the kind of confidence that came from never being told no, never facing real consequences for his actions. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His custom-tailored suit probably cost more than James made in 2 months, and his Rolex caught the light every time he gestured with his drink. James had cleaned Hayes's office enough times to know the man was a slob behind closed doors, leaving half-eaten takeout containers on his desk and spilling coffee on important documents without a second thought. Hayes spotted James near the edge of the dance floor, and something shifted in his expression, a predatory gleam that James recognized immediately. He'd seen that look before on bullies in high school, on men who derived pleasure from making others feel small. James tried to fade back toward his cleaning cart, but it was too late. Hayes was already moving in his direction with his entourage trailing behind like pilot fish following a shark. "Well, well," Hayes said loudly enough that nearby conversations paused, heads turning to see what was happening. If it isn't our dedicated maintenance staff, working hard even during our little party. What's your name again, janitor? James kept his expression neutral, years of practice helping him hide the humiliation that burned in his chest. James Robertson, sir. Right, Robertson, Hayes said, snapping his fingers as if the name had just come to him, though James suspected the man had never bothered to learn it in the first place. You know, Robertson, we were just talking about the entertainment tonight, or rather the lack of it. The DJ is playing it safe. Nobody wants to get up on that karaoke machine over there, and frankly, this party is becoming a bit of a snooze fest. You wouldn't happen to have any hidden talents, would you? The executives around Hayes chuckled, the kind of polite laughter that encouraged bad behavior from powerful men. James could feel more eyes turning their way, the crowd sensing drama, the way sharks sensed blood in water. His heart was pounding now, adrenaline flooding his system as he recognized the trap being laid before him. I'm just here to work, sir, James said quietly, hoping Hayes would lose interest and move on to easier prey. But Hayes wasn't done, not by a long shot. His eyes had lit up with an idea, the kind of inspiration that came from too much expensive scotch and too little human decency. You know what, Robertson? I'm going to make you an offer, a bet, if you will. I bet you can't sing. I bet you've never stood in front of a crowd and performed anything in your entire life. So here's the deal. You get up on that stage, you sing one song, just one song on that karaoke machine. And if you can actually pull it off without embarrassing yourself, I'll quit my job. Right here, right now, I'll walk out of Meridian Industries and never come back. The ballroom had grown quieter now, more people tuning in to the confrontation unfolding near the dance floor. James could see smartphones coming out, people positioning themselves to record whatever happened next. His hands were clenched at his sides, fingernails digging into his palms as he tried to decide how to respond. Walking away would be smart, would be safe, but there was something about Hayes's smug expression that made anger flare hot and bright in his chest. And if I don't do it? James asked, hating how his voice wavered slightly. Hayes shrugged, his smile widening. Then, I guess we all know exactly what kind of man you are. Someone who talks big but can't back it up. Someone who belongs exactly where he is, pushing a mop and emptying trash cans. Come on, Robertson, where's your sense of town? Adventure? Or are you too scared to take a chance when it's handed to you? James looked around the ballroom, at all the faces watching him with varying degrees of curiosity, pity, and anticipation. He thought about Sophie asleep at home, about how she deserved a father who didn't let bullies push him around, even when those bullies signed his paychecks. He thought about Elena and how she would have handled this moment. She would have told him to sing, would have reminded him that music was in his blood regardless of who was listening or why. I'll do it, James heard himself say, the words coming out before his brain could fully process the decision. I'll sing. Hayes's eyebrows shot up, genuine surprise flickering across his face before the arrogant mask slipped back into place. Well, the janitor has some spine after all. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to the room, projecting his voice like a ringmaster at a circus. It appears we're about to have some entertainment after all. Mr. Robertson here has agreed to grace us with a performance. The crowd parted as James walked toward the small stage, his legs feeling disconnected from his body, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. The DJ looked confused as James approached, glancing between him and the crowd as if trying to figure out what was happening. James could see the karaoke machine set up next to the DJ booth, a list of available songs displayed on a tablet screen. What are you singing? The DJ asked quietly, his expression sympathetic. He was young, maybe mid-20s, and something in his eyes suggested he understood exactly what was happening here. Understood that this wasn't about music or entertainment, but about humiliation and power. James scrolled through the song list with shaking fingers, his mind racing. Most of the options were popular hits, songs that would require showmanship and energy he didn't have in this moment. Then, he saw it. A song he'd performed 100 times before. A song he'd written himself, but had been covered by a local artist who'd had a minor hit with it back in 2015. The song was called Lighthouse. And he'd written it for Elena during her final months, when the cancer had been winning, and all he could do was hold her hand and promise her that he'd be okay. that Sophie would be okay, that they'd find their way home even in the darkest night. "This one," James said, pointing to the screen. "Lighthouse." The DJ nodded, cueing up the track. "You got it, man. Good luck." James took the microphone with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, and as he turned to face the ballroom, the reality of what he'd agreed to hit him like a physical blow. There had to be 200 people out there, all of them watching him, waiting for him to fail, waiting to confirm Hayes' assertion that he was nothing more than a janitor who didn't belong in their world. The opening notes of the song began to play, a gentle piano melody that he'd composed on an old keyboard in their tiny apartment while Elena slept in the next room. For a moment, his throat closed up completely, panic threatening to overwhelm him. Then he closed his eyes and let himself remember Elena's smile, the way she'd cry every time he sang this song to her, the way she'd made him promise to keep making music even after she was gone. He thought about Sophie and how he wanted her to grow up knowing her father had been brave, had stood up for himself even when it was terrifying, even when failure seemed inevitable. James opened his mouth and began to sing. His voice came out rough at first, rusty from years of disuse, but it was still there, the instrument he'd trained and developed over decades of practice and performance. The first verse talked about ships lost at sea, about darkness that seemed endless, about fear and longing and the desperate search for something to guide you home. James sang with his eyes closed, shutting out the ballroom and the crowd and Hayes' cruel smirk, letting himself fall into the music the way he used to, letting the song carry him instead of trying to control every note. The ballroom had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy and expectant. James moved into the chorus, his voice growing stronger, the muscle memory of performance returning even after 3 years of neglect. He sang about a lighthouse in the distance, a beacon of hope when everything else seemed lost, about love that transcended death and guided you home even when you couldn't see the shore. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it was honest, and in this moment, honesty was all he had to offer. James opened his eyes during the second verse and immediately wished he hadn't. The crowd was staring at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Some people had their hands over their mouths, others were completely still like they'd been frozen mid-motion. Near the back of the room, he saw a woman in a red dress openly crying, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her husband's arm. The sight should have thrown him off, should have made him stumble over the lyrics, but instead it pushed him deeper into the song, into the raw emotion he'd been avoiding for years. The second chorus built on the first, his voice climbing higher, adding runs and embellishments that came from somewhere beyond conscious thought. This wasn't the careful, controlled singing of someone trying not to embarrass themselves. This was the full-throated expression of grief and love and hope that had been bottled up inside him since Elena's funeral. The music was pouring out of him now, unstoppable, and all he could do was ride the wave and trust it wouldn't destroy him. The bridge of the song was the part Elena had loved most, the moment where the melody shifted from minor to major, where despair transformed into something that wasn't quite joy, but wasn't hopelessness either, some complex emotion that existed in between. James sang about finding light in the darkness, about choosing to believe even when belief seemed foolish, about love that lasted beyond the boundaries of life and death. His voice cracked slightly on the highest note, but it didn't matter. The crack just made it more real, more human, more true. As he moved into the final chorus, James finally allowed himself to look directly at Daniel Hayes. The CFO's face had gone slack, his earlier smugness completely erased. He looked shocked, possibly even ashamed, though James didn't trust that the feeling would last beyond this moment. Around Hayes, the other executives were equally stunned. Several of them had tears in their eyes. And James realized with a start that maybe he'd misjudged some of them. Maybe underneath the expensive suits and corporate armor, they were still people capable of being moved by honest emotion. The song ended with a single sustained note, James holding it as long as his breath allowed before letting it fade into silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The ballroom remained frozen, 200 people suspended in the aftermath of something they hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to process. Then someone started clapping, slow and deliberate, and within seconds, The entire room erupted into applause. People were standing now, a standing ovation for the janitor in the wrinkled uniform who'd just exposed his soul in front of them all. James stood on the stage, overwhelmed and disoriented, the microphone hanging loose in his hand. The applause washed over him like a wave, and he didn't know whether to laugh, or cry, or run from the room. He settled for a small nod of acknowledgement before setting the microphone back on its stand and moving toward the stairs at the side of the stage. His legs felt weak, adrenaline draining away and leaving him shaky and exhausted. Before he could make it off the stage, someone blocked his path. Margaret Liu, the company's chief operating officer, stood at the bottom of the stairs with an expression of absolute astonishment on her face. James had cleaned her office many times, had always thought of her as one of the kinder executives, someone who at least acknowledged his existence with a polite nod. "James," she said, and there was something in her voice he couldn't identify, something that sounded almost like wonder. "That was, I don't even have words. That song, Lighthouse, I know that song. My daughter plays it constantly, she's obsessed with it. I had no idea, did you write that?" James nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "Yes, ma'am. About 10 years ago. A local singer named Marcus Webb recorded it, and it got some regional airplay." Margaret's hand went to her chest, her eyes wide. "Marcus Webb is my nephew. He always said the songwriter was someone named J. Robertson. But I never connected it to you. James, that song got my family through a very difficult time. My daughter was in the hospital for months and she'd listened to it on repeat. It gave her hope when we had very little." End quote. Other people were gathering now, pushing closer to hear the conversation. James felt claustrophobic. Too many bodies in too small a space, too many eyes on him. A man in a navy suit, someone from the marketing department whose name James couldn't remember, spoke up. "I knew I recognized that voice. I saw you perform about 5 years ago at the Blue Moon Cafe. You were incredible. You had a whole set of original songs. I told my wife we'd just seen someone who was going to be famous someday. What happened? Why did you stop performing?" James didn't know how to answer that without explaining everything, without telling them about Elena's diagnosis and the medical bills, and how making music had felt impossible when the person he'd made it for was gone. He opened his mouth to attempt some kind of response when Daniel Hayes pushed through the crowd, his face flushed red with what might have been anger or embarrassment, or some combination of both. "That was quite a performance, Robertson," Hayes said, his voice tight and controlled. "I suppose well, a bet is a bet." The crowd quieted, everyone watching to see if Hayes would actually follow through. James had already forgotten about the bet and the chaos following his performance, but now it came rushing back, the CFO's promise to quit if James could actually sing. He could see the calculation happening behind Hayes's eyes, the man trying to figure out how to weasel out of his own words without losing face in front of the entire company. "Actually," Margaret Liu interjected before Hayes could continue, "I think we need to have a conversation about how we value talent in this company. James, would you be willing to meet with me and some of the other executives on Monday morning? I'd like to discuss a lot of things." "I have to work," James said automatically, his brain still catching up to everything that was happening. "My shift starts at 6. "We'll work around your schedule," Margaret assured him. "This is important, James. What we just witnessed, that level of talent shouldn't be wasted on, no offense, but you shouldn't be cleaning floors when you could be doing so much more." James felt a surge of defensiveness on behalf of every janitor, every cleaner, every person who did the unglamorous work that kept the world running. "There's nothing wrong with cleaning floors, ma'am. It's honest work, and it pays my bills." Of course, Margaret said quickly. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I just meant that you clearly have additional skills that could benefit the company in different ways. Please, just meet with us on Monday. Let's explore what options might be available." Before James could respond, a young woman he recognized as someone from Human Resources pushed through the crowd, her phone in her hand and her eyes wide with excitement. "You guys, this is already going viral. Someone posted the video and it's got like 50,000 views already. People are trying to figure out who this mystery singer is. Apparently everyone remembers Lighthouse, and they're freaking out that the original songwriter just performed it at some random corporate event. James felt the room tilt slightly, the implications of what she was saying almost too big to process. Viral. That meant millions of people could potentially see him singing, could be watching right now. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. He'd spent 3 years trying to be invisible, and now he was being broadcast to the world. His phone started buzzing in his pocket, multiple notifications coming through one after another. With shaking hands, James pulled it out and saw texts from Mrs. Chen, from old friends he hadn't talked to in years, from his sister who lived 2 states away. They were all saying the same thing, had all seen the video, were all asking if it was really him, asking why he'd never told them he could sing like that. The DJ had started playing music again, trying to give the party some sense of normalcy, but clusters of people kept approaching James, wanting to shake his hand, wanting to tell him how his song had affected them, wanting to know if he had other music they could listen to. It was overwhelming, being seen after so long being invisible, being valued after years of being dismissed. Part of him wanted to retreat, to grab his cleaning cart, and disappear into the service hallways, where things made sense, and he knew his place. But another part of him, the part that used to dream of stages and audiences, was waking up after a long hibernation. Daniel Hayes had vanished into the crowd, and James wondered if the man would actually follow through on his promise to quit. Somehow, he doubted it. Men like Hayes always found ways to rewrite the rules in their favor, always landed on their feet, no matter what. But maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the point wasn't whether Hayes quit, but whether James had found his voice. Again, literally and figuratively. Around 11 o'clock, after hours of conversations and questions and people treating him like someone who mattered, James finally managed to extract himself from the gala. He pushed his cleaning cart back through the service corridors, his mind spinning with everything that had happened. The video had over 2 million views now, according to the last update he'd seen, and his phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages and friend requests and interview requests from local media outlets. He cleaned up a few spills in the main corridor, working on autopilot while his thoughts raced. Margaret Liu wanted to meet with him on Monday, wanted to talk about opportunities within the company, but what did that even mean? He wasn't qualified for any corporate position. His resume was a patchwork of service jobs and night shifts. His degree in music from a community college was practically useless in the business world. Still, something had shifted tonight. Some door had opened that he'd thought was sealed shut forever. James thought about Elena and wished desperately that she could have been there to see it. To see him step onto that stage and reclaim the part of himself he'd buried with her. She'd always believed in his music, had always pushed him to take chances and put himself out there, even when it scared him. In a way, maybe she had been there. Maybe her memory had been the lighthouse guiding him through his fear and back to the thing he loved. When his shift finally ended at 2 in the morning, James drove home through empty streets, still processing the surreal events of the evening. He let himself into the quiet apartment, checked on Sophie, who was sleeping peacefully in her bed with her favorite stuffed elephant clutched to her chest, and then collapsed onto the couch in the living room. His phone was still buzzing, but he ignored it, needing a moment of silence to think. The guitar case was tucked away in the hall closet, buried behind winter coats and broken vacuum cleaners, and all the accumulated debris of life. James hadn't touched it in 3 years, couldn't bear to look at it for fear of what memories it would unleash. But now, in the quiet darkness of his living room, he found himself getting up and retrieving it, his hands remembering the weight and shape of the case. He opened it slowly, half afraid that the guitar would be damaged beyond repair from neglect. But the instrument looked fine, just dusty and in need of new strings, the wood still warm and familiar under his fingers. James sat back on the couch with the guitar in his lap, not playing yet, just holding it, letting himself feel the weight of possibility that came with this reunion. His fingers found the strings, muscle memory guiding them to the opening chords of Lighthouse. The guitar was badly out of tune, making the notes sound discordant and strange, but underneath the wrongness, he could hear the psalm, could feel it waiting to be played properly. James spent the next hour tuning the guitar, finding tools and extra strings in the case working patiently until each string rang true and clear. It was past 3 in the morning when he finally played the song all the way through, singing quietly so as not to wake Sophie. The music filled the small apartment, filling spaces that had been empty for too long. James felt tears running down his face, but he didn't stop playing, didn't stop singing, letting the grief and joy and hope flow through him and out into the world. When he finished, he sat in the darkness for a long time, the guitar still in his arms. Tomorrow, people would be talking about him, asking questions about where he'd been and why he'd stopped performing. Monday, he'd meet with Margaret Liu and find out what opportunities she thought existed for a janitor who could sing. But right now, in this moment, the only thing that mattered was that he'd found his way back to the music, back to the part of himself he'd thought was lost forever. James carefully put the guitar back in its case, but left it out instead of burying it in the closet again. He went to bed as the first hints of dawn were lightening the sky. Exhausted, but more awake than he'd felt in years. The video would continue spreading, the story would continue growing, and his life would probably never be quite the same. But for the first time since Elena died, that chaos didn't terrify him. It filled him with something that felt remarkably like hope. Sunday morning arrived with Sophie jumping on his bed, her 7-year-old energy undimmed by the early hour. James groaned and pulled a pillow over his face, but she, was relentless, pulling at his arm and demanding breakfast and attention. He'd only slept for about 4 hours, but there was no use fighting it. Once Sophie was awake, the whole household was awake. "Daddy," Mrs. Chen showed me something on her phone, Sophie said as James stumbled toward the kitchen to start coffee. "It was you singing at some fancy party. She said you're famous now." James nearly dropped the coffee filter. He'd been so caught up in processing everything last night that he hadn't thought about how to explain any of this to his daughter. Sophie had never heard him sing. Not really. He'd avoided music around her because it hurt too much, because it reminded him of everything they'd lost. "I'm not famous, sweetheart," James said, measuring coffee grounds with shaky hands. "I just sang one song at a party and someone recorded it. That's all." "But Mrs. Chen said millions of people watched it," Sophie insisted, climbing onto one of the kitchen chairs and watching him with Elena's eyes, the same deep brown that saw too much and forgave too easily. "She said you used to be a singer before I was born. Is that true?" James poured water into the coffee maker and turned it on, buying himself a moment to figure out how to answer. He sat down across from Sophie at their small kitchen table, the same table where they ate breakfast every morning, where she did her homework while he made dinner, where they played board games on his nights off. "Yes, it's true," he said finally. "Before you were born, and when you were very little, I used to perform music. I wrote songs and played guitar and sang at different places around the city. Your mom, she used to come to all my shows. She was my biggest fan." Sophie's face lit up with interest. She loved hearing stories about her mother, craved details about the woman she could barely remember. "What kind of songs did you sing?" "All kinds," James said, feeling the familiar ache in his chest that came with talking about Elena. "Sad songs, happy songs, love songs. The song I sang last night, I wrote that for your mom when she was very sick. It was about how love can guide you home, even when you feel lost. Can you sing it for me?" "Faye?" Sophie asked, her voice small and hopeful. James hesitated, then nodded. He went to the living room and retrieved the guitar, bringing it back to the kitchen. Sophie's eyes went wide when she saw it, like he'd produced a magical artifact from another world. He sat back down and adjusted the guitar in his lap, his fingers finding the familiar chords. This time, singing the song felt different, gentler somehow, like a conversation instead of a performance. He sang it for Sophie, watching her face as she listened, seeing her process the lyrics and the emotion behind them. When he finished, she was crying. But they weren't sad tears exactly. More like tears of recognition, of understanding something she'd been too young to grasp before. "Mom would have wanted you to keep singing," Sophie said with the certainty that children sometimes possessed, the kind of truth-telling that adults had forgotten how to do. "She wouldn't want you to be sad and stop doing something you love." James set the guitar aside, and pulled his daughter into a hug, marveling at how someone so small could be so wise. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart. Your mom would have wanted me to keep singing, and I think maybe it's time I started listening to that." They spent the rest of Sunday together, and James played more songs for Sophie. Old ones he'd forgotten he knew. New melodies that came to him as he experimented with chord progressions. His phone continued to buzz with notifications, but he ignored most of them, focusing instead on this time with his daughter, on rebuilding this bridge he'd burned between himself and his music. By Sunday evening, the video had over 5 million views and had been picked up by several major media outlets. James saw headlines calling him everything from "the singing janitor" to "mystery songwriter breaks the internet" to "corporate gala performance goes viral." His social media accounts, which he barely used, had exploded with new followers and messages. There were interview requests from morning shows, from podcasts, from music magazines that wanted to know his story. Marcus Webb, the singer who'd originally recorded Lighthouse, had posted about the video, confirming that James was indeed the songwriter and calling the performance the most powerful rendition I've ever heard, including my own. That endorsement had sent another wave of attention James's way, and he was starting to understand that his life had fundamentally changed, whether he was ready for it or not. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, typical March weather that couldn't decide if it wanted to be winter or spring. James dropped Sophie off at school, where several other parents recognized him from the video and wanted to chat. He kept the conversations brief, uncomfortable with the attention, and headed to Meridian Industries headquarters for his meeting with Margaret Liu and whoever else would be in the room. He arrived at the building at 9, 3 hours before his shift was supposed to start, wearing his nicest clothes, which still weren't anywhere near as nice as what anyone else in the building would be wearing. The security guard at the front desk, someone James had chatted with dozens of times during his night shifts, looked at him with new eyes, with recognition and something that might have been respect. "Mr. Robertson," the guard said, and the formal address felt strange coming from someone who usually just called him James or Buddy. "Ms. Liu is expecting you. Conference room 3 on the executive floor." James took the elevator up, his stomach churning with anxiety. The executive floor was a place he'd only been as a janitor, emptying trash and vacuuming carpets after everyone had gone home. Being there during business hours, being there as something other than invisible help, felt transgressive somehow, like he was breaking rules he didn't fully understand. Margaret Liu was waiting outside the conference room, and she smiled when she saw him approaching. "James, thank you for coming. I know this is all very unusual, but I promise we just want to talk, to see if there might be a better fit for you within Meridian." She led him into the conference room, which was occupied by several other executives he recognized by sight if not by name. Daniel Hayes was notably absent, and James wondered if the man had actually followed through on his promise to quit, or if he'd simply been excluded from this meeting. Margaret gestured for James to take a seat at the large table, and he did, feeling out of place and underdressed. "So," Margaret began once everyone was settled. "I'll be direct, James. That performance on Saturday night revealed that you have significant talent that's being wasted in your current position. Now, I want to be clear that there's absolutely nothing wrong with being a janitor. It's essential work, and we value everyone who contributes to this company. But if you're interested, we'd like to discuss some other possibilities." "What kind of possibilities?" James asked, his voice sounding strange to his own ears in the formal setting. A woman he didn't recognize, someone from human resources based on her badge, spoke up. "We've been looking into your background, James. You have a degree in music, you have years of performance experience, and based on the reaction to Saturday's video, you have a gift for connecting with people through song. We think there might be a role for you in our corporate communications department, specifically in creating content for our brand." End quote. James blinked, trying to process what she was saying. Creating content? Videos, social media presence, maybe even live performances at company events, Margaret explained. "Meridian has been trying to improve our public image, to seem more human and relatable. Having someone like you, someone with a genuine story and real talent, could be invaluable. You'd be writing songs, performing, helping us craft a narrative that resonates with people." End quote. "I don't know anything about corporate communications," James said honestly. "I don't know anything about marketing or brand management or any of that." "You wouldn't need to," the HR woman assured him. "We have people who handle the technical aspects. What we need from you is the artistry, the authenticity. We need someone who can tell our story in a way that moves people, the way you moved everyone in that ballroom on Ref." Saturday night. James sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. This was so far beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd agreed to this meeting. They were offering him a chance to make music professionally, to do the thing he loved within the structure of a stable job, with benefits and regular hours. It was the kind of opportunity he'd dreamed about years ago, before Elena got sick, before survival became more important than dreams. "What about my daughter?" James asked, because Sophie was always the first consideration, the lens through which he had to view every decision. "I need regular hours, need to be able to pick her up from school, and be there for her." "We can absolutely accommodate that," Margaret said. "In fact, having regular daytime hours would probably be much better for your family life than the night shifts you're working now. We'd start you at a salary that's, well, significantly more than you're making as a janitor, and you'd have full benefits, including health insurance with excellent coverage." The mention of health insurance hit James hard. He'd been working without insurance for the past year, couldn't afford the premiums on his current salary, and lived in constant fear that Sophie would get sick or injured. Having coverage again would mean security, would mean not lying awake at night worrying about medical bills he couldn't pay. "Can I think about it?" James asked, even though part of him wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to grab onto this lifeline with both hands and never let go. "Of course," Margaret said. "Take a few days, talk it over with your family if you need to. But James, I hope you'll seriously consider this. What happened on Saturday? That wasn't just a viral video or a feel-good moment. That was a revelation of who you really are, what you're capable of. Don't let fear or habit keep you from stepping into the life you deserve." The meeting ended shortly after, with promises to follow up and formal offer letters to be sent within the week. James left the conference room feeling like he'd stepped into someone else's life, like he was living in a story that couldn't possibly be his own. He made his way down to the janitorial office, where his supervisor looked at him with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been pride. "Robertson, you're all over the internet," his supervisor said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Never would have guessed you had that in you. You still planning to work your shift tonight?" "Yes, sir," James said, because he hadn't accepted the other offer yet, hadn't made any decisions that would change his current reality. "I'll be here." He worked his shift that night like he had hundreds of nights before, pushing his cart through empty corridors, cleaning offices and conference rooms and bathrooms. But everything felt different now, charged with possibility, with the sense that he was standing at a crossroads, and whichever direction he chose would determine the shape of his future. His coworkers treated him differently too, asking for autographs like he was someone important, playing the video on their phones during breaks, and marveling that this was the same guy who'd been emptying their trash cans for 3 years. Tuesday brought more media attention. A local news station wanted to interview him, and a music producer from Nashville had reached out about possibly working together. James agreed to the news interview, mostly because they offered to film it at his apartment so he wouldn't have to find childcare for Sophie. The reporter was a young woman named Jessica, who seemed genuinely interested in his story, not just the viral moment, but the whole journey that had led him there. "So, what made you stop performing?" Jessica asked, her camera operator filming from across the small living room. "You were building a following. Marcus Webb's recording of your song was getting real traction, and then you just disappeared from the music scene. What happened?" James glanced at Sophie, who was sitting quietly in the corner doing homework, but definitely listening. "My wife got sick," he said simply. "Cancer. She fought it for 2 years, and during that time, music became impossible. After she died, I had a daughter to raise alone, and I needed steady work, needed benefits and security, more than I needed to chase a bee. Dream that felt very far away." "But you kept the talent," Jessica said softly. "You kept the voice," The ability to move people the way you did on Saturday night. Did you ever sing during those 3 years? No, James admitted. Not once. It hurt too much. Reminded me of everything I'd lost. The music was something my wife and I shared, and without her, it felt wrong somehow. What changed? Jessica asked. What made you accept that challenge from the CFO? James thought about it, trying to put into words something he barely understood himself. I think I was tired of being invisible, tired of letting people like him make me feel small. And maybe I was ready to stop hiding from the part of myself that still loved music, even if it hurt to. Remember why? The interview aired that evening on the 6 o'clock news, and James watched it with Sophie curled up next to him on the couch. Seeing himself on television was surreal. Hearing his own story told back to him made it feel both more real and more like fiction. The station had included clips from the viral video, and watching it again, James could see what everyone else had seen, could understand why it had resonated so deeply. It wasn't just about the voice or the song. It was about vulnerability, about someone being brave enough to be fully human in front of strangers. Wednesday morning, James woke to find that the news interview had been picked up nationally. Excerpts were playing on morning shows across the country, and his story was trending on multiple social media platforms. The narrative had taken on a life of its own. The single dad janitor who'd been mocked by his rich boss, who'd turned humiliation into triumph through the power of his voice and his art. It was a story people wanted to believe in, wanted to share, wanted to be part of. Margaret Liu called in Wednesday afternoon, her voice excited and urgent. James, I know we said to take your time, but things are moving faster than we anticipated. The publicity around this is incredible, and it's all positive for Meridian. The board wants to move forward with bringing you on board, wants to make an announcement by the end of the week. I need to know, are you interested in this position? James looked around his small apartment, at the second-hand furniture, and the guitar case that was now a permanent fixture in the living room instead of hidden in a closet. He thought about Sophie and the life he wanted to give her, thought about Elena and what she would say if she were here. The answer had been forming in his heart since Saturday night, since the moment he'd opened his mouth and let the music back in. Yes, he said. Yes, I'm interested. I want to do this. Excellent, Margaret said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. We'll have the paperwork ready by Friday. Welcome to your new life, James. The rest of Wednesday and Thursday passed in a blur of phone calls and meetings and paperwork. James gave notice at his janitorial position, feeling both relief and a strange sadness at leaving behind the work that had sustained him through the hardest years of his life. His coworkers threw him an impromptu party in the break room, and several of them asked him to perform, to give them a private concert before he moved on to bigger things. He did, bringing his guitar to work on his last night shift and playing in the break room for the handful of people who'd been his companions through countless lonely nights. He sang Lighthouse, of course, but also other songs, covers, and originals, feeling the joy of performing for an appreciative audience without the weight of viral fame or corporate expectations. These were his people, the ones who'd seen him at his lowest and hadn't judged, and playing for them felt like a gift he could give in return. Friday arrived with unseasonably warm weather, the kind of early spring day that felt like a promise of better things to come. James put on the one suit he owned, bought years ago for Elena's funeral, and barely worn since, and headed to Meridian Industries for what would be his first official day in his new role. Sophie had been ecstatic when he'd told her about the job, had immediately started planning how they'd spend the extra money, talking about dance classes she wanted to take, and a bike she'd been coveting. The press conference was scheduled for 10 in the morning, held in the same ballroom where everything had started less than a week ago. Media outlets from across the region had sent reporters, and the room was packed with cameras and microphones and people waiting to hear what Meridian Industries had to say. James stood backstage with Margaret Liu and several other executives, his heart pounding with the same anxiety he'd felt before stepping onto that stage on Saturday night. "You ready?" Margaret asked, straightening his tie with a motherly gesture that made him smile. "As ready as I'll ever be," James said, which was the truth. They walked out together, and the flash of cameras was momentarily blinding. Margaret approached the podium and began speaking, explaining how Meridian Industries was proud to announce a new initiative in their corporate communications department, how they'd discovered incredible talent within their own workforce, how James Robertson represented the kind of innovation and authenticity they wanted to bring to their brand. That it was James's turn to speak, and he stepped up to the podium with hands that were steadier than he'd expected. He talked about his journey, about loss and rediscovery, about second chances and the courage it took to step into a new version of yourself. He thanked Meridian for seeing potential in someone they'd previously overlooked, and he made a quiet dig at the culture that had allowed someone like Daniel Hayes to think it was acceptable to humiliate employees for entertainment, noting that real change would require more than just one good hire. It would require examining the values that allowed such behavior in the first place. The reporters ate it up, asking questions about his plans, about whether he'd release new music, about his message for other people who felt stuck or invisible in their current circumstances. James answered as honestly as he could, trying to balance hope with realism, trying not to pretend that one viral video could solve systemic problems or that every story ended with this kind of fairy tale. Transformation. "What would you say to Daniel Hayes if he were here?" one reporter asked. And James could feel the room lean in, hungry for conflict, for drama, for revenge. "I'd say thank you," James said, and watched surprise ripple through the crowd. "I'd thank him for pushing me to do something I was afraid to do, for creating a situation where I had to choose between staying invisible and stepping into my own light." He meant it as cruelty, but sometimes cruelty can be a catalyst for change. "I don't forgive the behavior, but I'm grateful for the outcome." After the press conference, James spent the afternoon in meetings, learning about his new role, meeting his team, and beginning to understand the scope of what he'd be doing. It was overwhelming, and there were moments when he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake, if he was in way over his head. But then he'd remember the feeling of singing on that stage, the feeling of connecting with people through music, and he'd know that whatever challenges lay ahead, they were worth facing. He picked Sophie up from school that afternoon in his suit, and she laughed when she saw him, saying he looked like a different person. They went out for ice cream to celebrate, splurging on fancy flavors they'd never tried before, and James told her about his day, about the cameras and the reporters and the beginning of their new life. "Does this mean we're rich now?" Sophie asked, chocolate ice cream smeared across her face. "No, sweetheart," James said, laughing. "It means we're going to be okay. It means I don't have to worry as much about bills, and you can take those dance classes you want. It means we have a little breathing room. And you get to make music again," Sophie said. Like that was the most important part, and maybe it was. That weekend, James took Sophie to visit Elena's grave for the first time in months. They brought flowers, daisies that were Elena's favorite, and James told his wife's headstone everything that had happened, about the gala and the song and the second chance he'd been given. Sophie added her own stories, chattering about school and her friends and the bike she was saving up for. And James stood there feeling the bittersweet ache of missing someone while also being grateful for the life that continued in her absence. "I'm going to keep singing," James said to the headstone, to Elena, to the memory of who they'd been together. "I'm going to write new songs and perform, and be the person you always believed I could be. I'm going to raise our daughter to be brave and kind, and to never let fear steal her dreams. I'm going to live fully, even though you can't, especially because you can't." The wind picked up, rustling through the trees that surrounded the cemetery, and James chose to believe it was Elena's way of answering, of giving her blessing to whatever came next. He took Sophie's hand, and they walked back to the car, leaving the flowers behind, but carrying the memory forward. Monday brought his first real day of work in the new position, and James discovered that making music professionally was both everything he'd hoped and more challenging than he'd anticipated. His team consisted of young, energetic people who spoke in acronyms he didn't understand and referenced trends he'd never heard of. They were patient with him, enthusiastic about having him on board, but there was a learning curve that felt steep and sometimes insurmountable. His first project was to write a song for Meridian's new marketing campaign, something that would capture the company's values while also being genuine and emotionally resonant. James spent hours in the small office they'd given him, guitar in hand, trying to write something that didn't feel like a corporate jingle, trying to balance what they needed with what he was capable of creating honestly. The song came slowly, painfully, nothing like the easy flow of inspiration he remembered from years ago. Every line felt forced, every melody seemed derivative, and James began to wonder if his talent had been a fluke, if that one viral performance had been all he had left to give. He stayed late that first week, working through frustration and self-doubt, filling his office trash can with crumpled paper covered in rejected lyrics. Thursday evening, he was still in his office at 7, long after everyone else had gone home, when Margaret Liu knocked on his door. She looked tired but kind, and she carried 2 cups of coffee like a peace offering. "Struggling?" she asked, setting one of the cups on his desk. "Is it that obvious?" James asked, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Margaret sat down across from him, sipping her own coffee. "You know, when we brought you on board, I don't think we adequately prepared you for how different this would be from performing, writing on demand, creating for a specific purpose, working within constraints. It's a completely different skill set from pouring your heart out on a stage." End quote. "I feel like a fraud," James admitted. "Like I tricked everyone into thinking I was something I'm not." "You're not a fraud," Margaret said firmly. "You're an artist learning a new medium, and that takes time. The song you sang at the gala, that came from years of experience, from deep personal emotion, from a lifetime of music. You can't expect to recreate that magic in a week while trying to sell corporate values." End quote. "So, what do I do?" James asked, feeling lost and small. "You give yourself permission to be a beginner again," Margaret said. "You remember why you make music in the first place, and you find a way to bring that truth into whatever you're creating, even if it's for a commercial purpose. Authenticity isn't about the venue or the audience. It's about being honest in your expression, whatever form that takes." End quote. Her words settled something in James, gave him permission to stop trying so hard, to stop forcing inspiration, and instead wait for it to come naturally. He went home that night and played with Sophie instead of working, helped her with homework and made dinner, and read bedtime stories. He let his mind rest, let the pressure ease, and in that space of not trying, the song began to emerge. By the following week, he'd completed his first corporate project, a song that somehow managed to be both professional and genuine, that spoke to Meridian's stated values, while also feeling like something he'd actually want to listen to. The team loved it, played it in the conference room while everyone nodded and smiled, and James felt a surge of pride that was different from performance applause, but no less satisfying. Over the next few months, James settled into his new life, learning the rhythms of office work, building relationships with his colleagues, and slowly rebuilding his confidence as a musician. The viral fame faded gradually, the video's view count plateauing around 10 million, and then slowly being buried under newer content, newer stories, newer moments of collective attention. But the changes that moment had sparked continued to ripple outward. Meridian Industries implemented new policies around workplace respect and dignity, creating clear consequences for executives who abused their power. Daniel Hayes had indeed resigned, or been forced out, depending on who you asked, and the company culture began to shift towards something more humane, more aware of the value of every employee regardless of their position. James performed occasionally, small venues and local events, finding joy in live music without the pressure of viral fame. He wrote psalms for Meridian but also for himself, slowly building a catalog of new material that reflected who he was now, not who he'd been before Elena's death. Some of the songs were about loss, some about hope, some about the strange journey of becoming visible after years of invisibility. Sophie thrived with the increased stability, taking dance classes and making friends and growing into a confident, creative child who loved to hear her father play guitar. James made sure to be present for school events and bedtime rituals, to prioritize being a father above being an artist or an employee, remembering that the reason he'd made all these choices was to give his, quote, daughter a good life. A year after the viral video, James was invited back to the Grandview Hotel's ballroom for Meridian's annual gala, but this time as a guest rather than janitorial staff. He wore a rented tuxedo that actually fit, stood among the crowd with a glass of champagne, and watched as the company celebrated another successful year. Margaret Liu found him near the dessert table and smiled. "How does it feel to be back here under very different circumstances?" she asked. James looked around the ballroom, remembering how he'd felt a year ago, invisible and small, and trapped in a life that seemed to have no exit. "Surreal," he said honestly. "Sometimes I still can't believe any of this is real." "It's real," Margaret assured him. "You earned it, James. Not just with that one performance, but with the work you've done since, the growth you've shown, the grace you've handled all of this with." The DJ started playing music, and James recognized the opening notes of Lighthouse, the song that had changed everything. People turned to look at him, smiling, and someone called out asking if he'd sing it. James hesitated for only a moment before nodding, before making his way to the stage where the DJ handed him a microphone with a knowing grin. This time, there was no fear, no trembling hands or racing heart, just the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he was capable of. James began to sing, his voice filling the ballroom just as it had a year ago. But now it felt different, felt like a celebration rather than a revelation, felt like coming home to a place he'd never really left. The crowd listened in respectful silence, and when he finished, the applause was warm and genuine, but not overwhelming, not the shocked response of people witnessing something unexpected. They'd heard him sing before, knew what he could do, and this was simply him doing it again, simply him being himself in front of people who'd learned to see him. James left the stage and returned to his place in the crowd, just another guest at the party, just another employee of Meridian Industries. But he carried with him the knowledge that he'd faced his fear and come out the other side, that he'd reclaimed the part of himself he'd thought was lost, that he'd built a new life from the rubble of the old one. Later that night, after the gala ended and he'd driven home through the quiet city streets, James checked on Sophie, kissed her forehead while she slept, and then sat in the living room with his guitar. He played softly, improvising melodies and lyrics, letting music flow through him the way it used to, the way it would for the rest of his life. He thought about Daniel Hayes and the cruel challenge that had sparked all of this. Thought about how sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best transformations. He thought about Elena and how she'd always believed in him, how she'd pushed him to be brave, even when bravery seemed impossible. He thought about Sophie and the future he was building for her, a future where she'd know her father had been strong enough to start over, wise enough to accept help, and brave enough to step into his own light. The guitar strings hummed under his fingers, creating harmonies that existed only in this moment, that would never be recorded or performed or shared with anyone beyond these walls. James played for himself, for Elena, for Sophie, for everyone who'd ever felt invisible or stuck or certain that their best days were behind them. He played because he could, because the music was still there, because starting over didn't mean forgetting where you'd been. It meant honoring the journey while moving forward into whatever came next. Outside, the city lights twinkled against the dark sky, thousands of stories unfolding in thousands of windows, each person carrying their own griefs and hopes and possibilities. James was just one story among millions, but it was his story, and he'd learned that sometimes one moment of courage, one decision to step into fear instead of running from it, could change everything. He played until his fingers grew tired, until the melodies began to blur together, until sleep called him toward rest and dreams. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new songs to write, new ways to balance art and commerce and fatherhood and life. But tonight, in this moment, James was exactly where he needed to be, making music in a quiet room, holding on to the past while reaching toward the future, invisible to everyone except the people who mattered most. The janitor who'd sung one song and changed his life had become simply James, a father, a musician, a man who'd learned that it's never too late to reclaim yourself, never too late to step out of the shadows and into the light, never too late to remember that you are more than the circumstances that tried to define you. And in the end, that was the real story. Not the viral fame or the corporate redemption or the fairy tale transformation, but the simple truth that courage, even when it comes wrapped in fear, can open doors you thought were permanently closed. James set the guitar aside and went to bed, grateful for the strange path that had led him here. Grateful for the daughter sleeping down the hall. Grateful for the memory of a wife who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Grateful for the music that had waited patiently for him to come home. Tomorrow he'd wake up and keep building this new life, one day at a time, one song at a time, one moment of bravery at a time. But tonight, he rested in the knowledge that he'd found his way back to himself, that he'd survived the darkness, and discovered that even in the deepest night, there was still a lighthouse calling him home. Still a voice inside him worth listening to. Still a story worth telling. And that was enough. More than enough. Everything he needed to keep moving forward, into whatever came next.